15th century Italian longsword by Balaur Arms. Check this out. That's crazy. Hello there. Let's do a brief review of the Balaur Arms 15th century Italian longsword and address some of the controversies involving the Balaur Arms brand. So this is a new model by Balaur Arms offered in 2020 as a collaboration with Kult of Athena owner and founder Ryan. Kult of Athena is a major distributor of historical weaponry reproduction in North America. They've been doing this for over 2 decades now, so they have a lot of experience looking at historical swords reproduction primarily. Ryan came up with some designs and give to a contractor called the Eric Swordsmithing, and they go through a middleman called the Overseas Trading Company. Their collaboration pretty much ended in year 2021, Although there are several new models being offered towards the end of the year, Kult of Athena did an independent investigation of the blade steel that Balaur Arms makers claim to use. It's claimed that this sword is made of 5160 high carbon spring steel, which is a popular choice for blade makers here in the US, even though in the recent decade has been phased out by 6150 high carbon steel. And they found out to be something closer to 1561, which is a steel of similar carbon content, around 0.3%. So they have some different composition of chromium, manganese, and such. I don't know whether that makes an inferior steel, but I wish the maker could be honest about it. When this sword was first offered, I was very excited because from the looks of it, it borrows heavily from the Brescia's Madonna. Almost the entire hilt is lifted from that 15th century Italian example, but the blade is more of a Germanic type in the 15th century. Features a slender blade with hollow ground diamond cross section and a very progressive profile taper. 35 inches in blade length. That's slightly shorter than the typical Type 18B sword. But the other characteristics, the width and the profile taper, the distal taper, the prominent central ridge is fairly typical of the Type 18B sword. It's a good cut and thrust sword with certain rigidity reinforced by this central ridge. Yet having a hollow ground blade reduce the weight and make the blade overall proficient at cutting. It took a while for Kult of Athena to ship because they haven't sharpened up the edges. These are all made as blunt, having a 1.5 millimeter thick in the edge, pretty much rounded. And the sharpening Kult of Athena did on this sword isn't very adequate. It's quite dull, actually. I have to put my edge on it, and because the secondary bevel has a very obtuse angle, it's very difficult to sharpen it. Fit and finish actually surprised me. When I got it out of the box, there's a lot of rusting on the fittings, so which means the fittings are made of mild steel, which is nice, but they could have cleaned it up and oiled it to protect it from corrosion, but they just didn't bother to do that. And unlike the photos I saw on Kult of Athena's website, which has very clean lines and very smooth transitions between the fittings, any two components, this one has epoxy seeping out everywhere you look. Everywhere where there's a crevice, you can see epoxy being used liberally, and it's quite unsightly. Given its price tag, pushing in the lower end for even budget entry-level longswords, I wouldn't have thought it too much for it. The blade has lots of rippling, the line kind of wavers, central ridge, and there are some noticeable asymmetry as well. But if you just look at it from a distance, the profile looks fine for its time. What I dislike the most is this flexibility. And it also vibrates in the wrong note. Okay, it doesn't vibrate for too long because the blade length is only 35 inches. But there's a lot of hand shock or vibration near here, where it's wrong, where you have a long-bladed sword. There are two vibration nodes. One is somewhere on the middle and upper portion of the blade that remains static. This is an ideal cutting portion because it doesn't vibrate so much. It's a little low on this blade, which is bad news already, But the secondary vibration note is near here at hilt. So you can see how much my hand vibrates when there's a vibration in blade flexes. This is what the sword community calls unscientific blade harmonics. These Balaur Arms swords are marketed heavily as budget swords featuring a good amount of distal tapering. And we know that distal tapering is of paramount importance to the handling of swords, particularly medieval European swords. This Italian longsword is no exception, but what exactly went wrong about its design probably has something to do with its distal tapering. You see, it features a convex distal tapering, meaning that the thinning of the blade thickness doesn't happen in a linear fashion. First, it started out at 5.6 millimeters at the base, and I will argue that's pretty thin for Type 18B swords. As we know that Type 18B sword is in general cut and thrust, a very balanced sword. So it needs to maintain a certain degree of rigidity to fulfill that role. Usually at the base, it's around 7 to 8 millimeters, sometimes even thicker than that. And at 5.6 millimeters, I would definitely say it's probably insignificant, inadequate for this purpose. And it tapers down rapidly to 4.4 millimeters at around 7 or 8 inches from the base. So that's already very thin, 4.4 millimeters, and it maintains that thickness to around 26 inches from the base. It's tapered down to 3 millimeters at the point of percussion. That's quite thin for this kind of sword. It's all right. This thickness is all right for other types, such as Type 13A or 12A, the Great Sword of War, as they feature a lenticular cross-section, not a diamond cross-section with hollow ground geometry. And then it tapers back to 4 millimeter near the tip. This feature is sometimes seen on some late medieval swords, maintaining rigidity near the tip for stiff thrusting. And it does work to a certain degree, but overall, the thinness of the entire blade is just not adequate enough for a Type 18B sword. And that results in some pretty peculiar dynamics in the blade. Harmonically speaking, I think it just vibrates in the wrong note. And which is a shame. They could have beefed up the central ridge, at least. The thickness of the edge, I have no issue. The central ridge could be just more pronounced. Ideally, this kind of sword will have a base thickness near the central ridge of 8 millimeters thick. And if you look at my review of the Albion region, which is a very good implementation of the Type 18B sword, it has a very thick central ridge throughout the entirety of the blade, even though it tapers down dramatically in the thickness. On the lower portion of the blade, this ensures the rigidity of the blade, but also there's more mass, so it will improve the handling. This sword is very light in the blade, so it's very easy to maneuver. Distal tapering and profile tapering pretty much caused that, but they overdid it. The entire sword weighs 3 pounds, which is, for its size, is historical, a little bit below average in weight. And you see that a lot of the weight is in the hilt. It has a very thick crossguard. It does seem to be well formed. A robust crossguard is always good news. You have to parry and you don't want this to break in half, expose your hand, obviously. I have no issue with that. You see the slot on the crossguard has a very big aperture than the cross section on the blade. But interestingly, it's not a sloppy rectangular shape you typically find on budget swords, but clearly a hollow ground diamond cross section, which means this is tailor-made for this model, but also that originally the blade was designed to be 52 millimeters wide and close to 9 millimeter in thickness, which is more than adequate for Oakeshott Type 18B. It's probable that the contract maker couldn't fulfill this while still implementing a substantial distal and profile taper. And the pommel has this very unique sense stopper shape for the precious Madonna. Obviously, it's a solid mass, so it counterbalances the blade quite a bit, which make it balance very close to the hilt. It's really easy to maneuver. However, it just doesn't feel right when you handle the sword. It has a very flimsy feeling. It starts to flex even when you swing the sword before it makes contact with the target, any sort of impact at all. So sometimes it will just throw the edge alignment off. In addition, it also flexes in this direction, back and forth, which is not good news at all. Even very flexible swords should only flex in this plane. Horizontally, it really should not swing back and forth in this direction. And that sometimes really makes the cutting performance suffer. The sword in itself is overall handsome looking with some cosmetic features. Although I would prefer a Type 16A blade with a fuller to stick closer to the original Brescia Spadona sword. It is easy to move around, although its floppiness and bad edge geometry make it not a great sword for cutting. For its price tag, it's not a ripoff. If you order the unsharpened version, it might be quite an adequate training sword for form and flourish. I use it a lot in motion capturing for longsword animations in the video game I am developing. Fortune favors the bold, link in the description below. It definitely could have beefed up the blade, at least in the lower portion. Whether that will improve the overall dynamics and harmonics is difficult to say. It may have something to do with the specific spring tempering of the blade. Now some other people have got this sword, perhaps from a different batch, a later batch. Kyle of Alien channel got his hand on a factory second Italian Longsword by Balaur Arms, and that sword is noticeably rigid, so it contributes a lot to its cutting performance, obviously. And I suspect the blade configuration and the hilt construction, the over-reliance on epoxy, fill the gap inside the grip, the crossguard, which has a very large opening to receive the blade. You see it's about 5 millimeters altogether broader than the base of the blade. This is an issue, and indeed, because it's overly flexible in cutting, sometimes it does fail, which has something to do with its edge sharpness. But when it fails, it vibrates a lot, and it really doesn't contribute to the overall health of the hilt construction. And over time, it became somewhat loose. Yeah, listen to this. So quickly. Just doesn't inspire any confidence. The hilt components has clear design element borrowed from the Brescia Spadona. All the edges are pretty crisp. The form of the pommel is basically symmetric. However, the finish is a little rough, and the pin block has some transition between this block and the actual pommel. Overall, it's not bad looking. The crossguard is typical for the Brescia Spadona, and of course, so is the grip with very even cord wrapping and this central riser, very characteristic of the surviving example in Brescia. But there's a lot of scratches, pitting everywhere. It just has a very unfinished feeling about it. It has 2 marks, which isn't necessarily a bad thing in itself. In handling, because it has a lot of geometry and it has many facets in the crossguard, it doesn't hurt you or cause any discomfort. There's no sharp edges, so to speak, which is nice. The crossguard has this flare, just up curve. It's not aligned with the blade on one side, and 2 sides of the crossguard, where you have this center raised section here, they're not symmetrical on both sides. Pretty rough. The sense stopper pommel is a unique aspect of the Brescia Spadona, and it's recreated with some care. It's worse than the photos in the product page on Kult of Athena, and you can see a lot of asymmetry, wavy lines in this multifaceted sense stopper pommel. And this pin block is not aligned well with the pommel on one side. On the other side, it has a better transition. On this side, the transition is totally botched. And the pin is well done and send it to be flush with the pin block, which is nice. The grip is perhaps the best part. Relatively flush with both the pommel and the crossguard. And the way leather wrapping is done on top of wooden core is very nice. You don't feel the seam here at all. It has an oval cross section. However, on the upper portion, it has a flat area for you to index the edge alignment, which is very subtle design. The cord wrap on the grip is evenly done. Has a good texture. The color of the leather dye is very nice. So overall, the grip is perhaps the best part of the sword. There's some evidence that the maker of the Balaur Arms brand have been doing some all sorts of work for Dark Sword Armory, and you can see here one being showcased on their Facebook page. The owner showcased the casting for the fittings of a new Dark Sword Armory model. And you can see the contract work they do for Red Dragon, which is a historical European martial arts supplier. They have some new steel sword designs. The scabbard is completely identical to the Dark Sword Armory scabbards. So this confirms that they are the all-source contractor for all these scabbards of Dark Sword Armory swords. Overseas trading companies branding out Endeavor met an unfortunate and premature end when they tried to forego Kult of Athena to sell their latest Kriegsmesser model, and when several persons I know paid in advance, they refused to ship the swords and held out for months before customers eventually claimed being defrauded. On the other hand, since Kult of Athena's ownership changed hands, there have been talks with Windlass for future collaborations to continue the Balaur Arms brand. Some people in the community are not thrilled to hear this based on Windlass' track record of skimping on distal tapering on their sword blades and having a tendency of having simple and ahistorical hilt fittings. Many of Windlass models are either overweight and feel dead in the hand because of this, or having overall thin and floppy blades. They have been working with authorities in the historical European martial arts community to improve this. I have a cautious optimism that the said authorities would push Windlass to up their games and implement the correct distal tapering and improve the hilt designs for Balaur Arms new models and Windlass' own designs. Until then,
I'll see you on the next sword review. If you find value in this video, please kindly like and subscribe.